We're gonna talk about whether or not you should train with offset weights, and we're gonna start right now. Okay, so recently I did a podcast with Joel Seedman, and after you watch this video, hopefully you click on the link down in our description, you go over and you watch that entire thing, give us that watch time. It's a sweet interview. Now, what we wanted to do was give Joel that platform. Yes, enter comments. I can't believe you're giving him a platform, but we wanted to hear what he had to say. We wanted to hear what his system is built on and how he came about all these things, and just listen. Just listen. That was the whole point. And one of the takeaways that I had was I wanted to look into some of the stuff he was saying. Okay, he brought up some research around offset training and asked him for some researchers specifically, but he just said, yeah, there was a recent study on offset training around the bench press. And so I looked it up and I wanted to analyze it and I wanted to look at what were the results. And this is where we get into some of this right away. And I wanted to see, like, is it worth trying? And then we're gonna have another video off of this in the future. So really this is like a 3-part series where we're gonna actually show some interesting stuff that we're testing out to sort of challenge it, right? So let's go into this study. It's changes in muscle pattern activity during the asymmetric flat bench press, okay? So offset training in its simplest form. And this came out in 2020. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through this, okay? So we're just looking real quickly. The abstract. Studies aim to compare muscle activity between the symmetric and selected asymmetric loads. Just muscle activity. They're comparing muscle activity, that's it, which results in greater muscle activity. That doesn't necessarily mean adaptation, but we'll see here. It'll show us some interesting stuff. So 2.5%, 5%, and 7.5% differences in load position between sides of the bar. Okay, so let's say they take the flat bench press, they use 70% in this case for a 1 RM. So if you bench press 100 kilos, they take 70 kilos, and then they change 2.5%, 5%, 7.5% off the side of the bar to increase it to favor one side. Study includes 10 resistance trained males, okay, so just 10, but it's still an interesting study to this point. 25.5 years, around 82, 83 kilos, somewhere in that regards. Bench press is around 104.5 kilos. So these guys are about as strong as a 7th grade male at garage strength. Okay, so the experience is 5.5 years. Why are they only bench pressing 104 when they've been training for 5.5 years? These dudes need peak strength. By the way, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store, and get that bench over 105 kilos. Now, the methods that they use to assess the differences in muscle activity between both sides of the body and load placement, the participants performed several attempts of the bench press with symmetric and asymmetric load at 70% of their 1 RM in a random order. They go symmetric, they went 2.5%, 5%, and 7.5% differences in load positions between sides of the bar. The peak muscle activity of dominant and non-dominant body side were recorded. So the non-dominant side, let's say you're right-handed, that'd be the left side. Non-dominant side was recorded for the pecs, the delts, and the long head of the tricep, triceps brachii, TB. Okay, so the pecs, the delts, so let's go, pecs, delts, long head. Okay, that's what they're looking at. And they're looking at that peak muscle activity. Two-way repeated measures analysis of variance indicated a statistically significant main interaction between side and load for pecs, delts, and the triceps. So the results of this study showed that asymmetrically loaded bench press leads to significantly higher muscular activity. This is what Joel had said on the podcast, right? So this leads to higher muscle activity on the loaded side. The offset training method during bilateral resistance exercise may be effective. Now, I literally found this right after we were on the podcast with Joel. Okay, so then I was like, all right, well, what do we see down here? There is a letter to the editor around this, and I just wanted to cover that quickly. And I wanted to show some examples that Joel uses. And we do start to see here some other, so non-dominant to dominant side, we see that. Another one here, which is a little bit different, and I think this is a little bit later, the muscle activity in asymmetric bench press among resistance trained individuals. So the one I wanted to go into here was essentially this letter to the editor just went into, they were excited, the crossover study examined neuromuscular effects of adding additional loads for one side of the barbell. I thought this was a pretty cool paper, right? As the authors of this review stated, the prime movers in the bench press have not been examined. Therefore, the present paper was of great interest. And they're happy to see that even though it was a small sample size, right here, small sample size, only 10, which is why I highlighted that, there was a lack of kinetic and kinematic data. There was no collection of EMG from the antagonist and core muscles, and the use of only one external load. This could be considered a proof of concept study. So they basically are saying, like, look, this stuff's pretty interesting. The study wasn't well done, but it's something that we could look at in the future. And actually, I think if they would start to analyze things like the trunk, trunk while they're doing these tests, you might even see greater activation from the trunk, which could be, an interesting thing. And so first, the lateral movement of the barbell was also not controlled. So think about if it's offset, you're gonna see a little bit of movement here. To go further into detail, we end up running our own in-house experiment with this stuff with some of our elite football players, which we'll go into in that future video. And you immediately will see that with all these athletes, okay? So that's one aspect. Second, the research group conducted between muscle comparisons, compared left and right pectoralis and not within muscle. So essentially, like if it's loaded on the right side, if it's a heavier offset on the right side, they should do a heavier offset on the left side, and then they could look at the right pec when it's offset to the left and when it's offset to the right. So that's criticized and not recommended in recent reviews. So that's something that also needs to be brought up in future papers around this. So the lack of homogeneity within and between muscles, in addition to the physiological and non-physiological factors influencing the EMG. It makes these comparisons difficult. Peak muscle activity was used to examine the prime mover's activity. The stochastic EMG signal measuring dynamic movements are influenced by factors such as electrode shifting, changes in conductivity, and crosstalk from other muscles. So they don't think that using the peak and not the mean activation decreases the ecological validity. I think this is interesting because oftentimes when you're using like velocity-based training, you will typically see on a more compound movement that's like a high resistance, like a back squat, bench press, you will see more. Let's just look at the mean. I don't know if that's this similar, but it's an interesting sort of thought process. In the turnover from eccentric to concentric muscular contraction, or if it's in a specific range of motion where the muscle filaments overlap maximally. Analyzing peak EMG values or mean integrated EMG activity may cause differences in the subsequent level of muscle activity. Finally, the comparisons between symmetric and asymmetric loads. The authors examined 70% of the 1 rep max from the symmetric 1 rep load. So 70 kilos in our example, right? Naturally, using asymmetric loads causes extra load on one side and lower loads on the other. With increasing asymmetry, the loaded side lifts closer and closer to the 1 RM, even if the total loads were 70%. However, using the same absolute loads and not relative loads has previously demonstrated differences in muscle activity. They're pointing out these differences or issues in this specific study. Again, finally, as a third problem, the consequence of the above, and since the aim of the study was to compare the execution of different conditions with the same loading, we argue that the most correct approach would have been to use relative loads instead of the absolute loads. I'm assuming that they would mean you take 70 kilos, okay, and you would use 70 total kilos, so you go like 35 kilos on each side of the bar, and then you would increase 35 kilos to, let's just for simple math say it should increase to 37.5, and then on the left side 32.5 kilos. So based on the limit, I'm believing that's what they're saying there. I'm not 100% clear, but they do come in, okay, it's our opinion of the present study need to be interpreted with a large amount of caution. Well, I added the large. Just interpret this stuff with caution, and then, for example, the inconclusive findings of the prime movers may be explained by the above mentioned factors. Okay, so just read this with caution. And I think that basing that whole system off of that, you just gotta have some caution. Now, that doesn't mean it's totally worthless. What I think the big takeaway as a strength coach is that you've gotta read that, you've gotta pay attention to when they come out with future offset work. And then what I think you really should be doing is you read it with caution, and then you come up with, okay, how can I use this or test it myself and see if there's any difference? And one thing that I thought about, and this is a pretty simple movement, but it's pretty tough. You could go try that out today and you'll find it's a pretty challenging movement. What I ended up doing was taking our elite football guys, and this is what you're gonna see, and we'll go into a full video on how we break down papers and then apply it. It's like, where can I find in their training a low risk point to put these things into their training? And then if these movements are as valuable as they are expressed to be, meaning like life-changing, you will change your entire program because of these movements, then we should be able to see something within about 8 weeks of implementation, and possibly even quicker if they are as good as we believe or as some people are claiming. So I think the interesting part was just going over the paper, looking at how Joel uses these, and in this case here, some simple holds there, some simple presses here, and some simple overhead presses here, and what happens with the trunk and what happens with the footwork and the hips is not nearly as challenging, though. I think this is a contralateral load there, is quite a bit easier. But also, this is one thing that I will say too that Joel brought up is like many different types of loads or offset loads that you can then do, ipsilateral, contralateral, blah, 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 all of that. Is Joel right or wrong? I think with the research, and I think with looking at these researchers that are looking at everything, I would start to question like, well, what about overall load? Like what if we compared that offset of 70% to a 90% bilateral equal load, 90% of max, and we equated the reps. Okay, so the reps are equal. So we would do, let's say 20 reps of 90% versus 20 reps of a 70% offset load. What's the adaptation? What's the stimulation? What's the perceived increase, or what is the increase on a benchmark lift? And I think that that's one of the big factors that I'm gonna challenge here, is that there doesn't seem to be like clear benchmarks or clear goals that we're working towards when we're doing these exercises, when we're doing these movement patterns. So I thought this was pretty cool. I like the paper. We're gonna share the link to the paper down in the description. We're gonna have that podcast with Joel. You can check that out. Head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store. If you are one of those 10 athletes that was in the research paper that can only bench press 104 kilos, I promise after 5 years of training, you'll be benching way more than 104 kilos. Because remember, freaks, if you wanna become a champion, you've always gotta cultivate your power. Peace.